Good morning, folks. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to, as Andy said, talk to you about radical new models of commissioning, and I'm going to say the words human learning systems a lot to you. Human learning systems. Clear. So, this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about complexity and why working in complexity means that we need to commission differently. And in order to embrace complexity, I'm going to describe to you the ways of working that a bunch of funders and commissioners throughout the country are using, and the language that they use of human learning systems. So, starting, what does it mean to work in complex environments? Well, I mean three things when I talk about working in complexity. Firstly, that people are complex. We've got used to speaking the language of complex needs now, meaning kind of people with particularly difficult, intractable problems. But actually, I want to assert something more fundamental. I want to assert that everybody's lives are complex. Because what makes my life meaningful and interesting and important to me is different than for you, than for you, than for you. There is an infinite variety of ways to be human. And if we're looking to create positive outcomes for people, we need to understand and respond to that variety. Secondly, the issues that we're dealing with are complex. And by that, I mean interdependent and interwoven. So, for example, take an issue like homelessness. We know that homelessness is very rarely just an issue about housing. It's frequently an issue about mental health, and maybe substance misuse, and maybe domestic violence, and maybe. And finally, the systems that respond to these issues are complex. Think about the number of different organisations involved in the lives of people that we care about. There are public sector organisations, there are official, formal, voluntary sector organisations, there are civil society organisations, there are networks of friends and family, there are private sector organisations. All of these organisations go up to making an outcome in someone's life. So the systems that respond to these things are complex. And so my assertion is that we need to embrace complexity because life is complex. And previously, we've spent the last 30 years pretending that it's simple in order to make this stuff easier to manage. But when we pretend it's simple, we do a disservice to the work and to the people that we care about. So, complexity. And it's easy to say complexity, but I wanted to give you a little visual illustration of it. Hands up, who knows what this diagram is? That's because we get some health people in the room. So this is the systems map of obesity, produced by the Government Foresight Office in 2007. Basically, they locked a bunch of public health people in the room and told them they weren't allowed out until they identified all the causes of obesity and all the relationship between all of those causes. So they came up with 108 different causes of obesity. And the relationship between all of those, you can't see all the individual factors on this diagram, it's too small, but you can see them summed up into things like food production and supply, macroeconomic drivers, education, the media, the nature of work, technology, the built environment, early life experiences. Down in the bottom right-hand corner of this system, healthcare and treatment options. So, for the outcome of obesity, these would be the things we would tend to commission, right? Obesity, the outcome, is caused by the relationship of all of these factors working together. It's the whole system that produces the outcome of obesity, and the same for any outcome that we care to think about. It's the whole system that produces an outcome. Now imagine you're one of these organisations, healthcare and treatment, in the bottom four factors in the bottom right of this system. Imagine we use a payment by results or other form of outcomes-based accountability model. You're being held accountable for the behaviour of the system as a whole. You're being held accountable for things you don't control. And if you're held accountable for things you don't control, if you're any kind of competent manager, you learn to manage what is in your control, which is the production of data. Which is why all the evidence, every single piece of evidence there is about outcome-based performance management or payment by results says it causes gaming. Because the only rational thing to do in a complex system, if you're being held accountable for things you don't control, you learn to manage the production of data. Anyway, so this is complexity and its relationship to commissioning. So, this is the most important thing. If you only take one thing away from my presentation today, let it be the idea that outcomes are not delivered by organisations. It's so important that I wrote it in red and in capital letters. And so this is an important message, so I would like you to repeat it back to me. So after 3, we're all going to say together, outcomes are not delivered by organisations. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Outcomes are not delivered by organisations. Thank you. You're very good. The outcomes we desire are emergent properties of complex systems. This is the relationship between complexity and commissioning, right? So, this has some quite radical implications for the purpose of commissioning, right? If you accept complexity, if we accept the complex reality of the world, it changes the purpose of commissioning. Commissioners working in this complexity-informed way do not purchase services which deliver outcomes, because they can't. They know that that's impossible. What they do is nurture the systems from which good outcomes emerge by effectively enabling collaboration and coordination between the different actors in the system. So, commissioners commission activity which responds to human variety, so all the different ways of being human in a system, and adapts to change. If I'd had more time, I'd show you other diagrams that the behavior of complex systems is dynamic, right? As soon as you try and nail it down into something like that, it's wrong, because it's changed. So the other aspect of responding to complexity is it must be able to respond to dynamic change. So, what that means for commissioning practice, it means no more process specification. You cannot, as a commissioner in the system, understand all the interactions of all the elements in that system to specify what people need. It's impossible. To specify what the variety of human responses should be. You can't do it. You can't set output targets for that because you don't know how those output targets will interact with all of those other things to produce good outcomes. And you cannot know what the desired outcomes for different people are, because those outcomes are as various as there are people, and they will change over time. So, no more of that. Stop it. So what else can we do? This was the question that I was asked about 2.5 years ago. Okay, we understand that that outcome-based performance management and the payment by results doesn't work. What the hell else can we do? So, I've spent the last 2.5 years trying to answer that question. In May 2017, we released the report on the left, A Whole New World, Funding and Commissioning Complexity. It's a report about public management with complexity in the title. I didn't really think anyone would care. But actually, over 500 organisations in the UK, charitable foundations, public sector commissioners, organisations working on the ground, put their hands up and went, yes, that sounds like us. We would like to do that, or we are working like that. So we've spent the last 18 months or so working alongside them to see how they're doing it. And later today, we release a new report called Exploring the New World. You see the theme. Practical insights for funding, commissioning and managing in complexity. So I'm going to take you through just some of the headlines of that. Later today, you'll be able to see more of the detail of what that complexity-informed practice looks like. The key ideas. It involves being human to one another. I'm going to dig into this a bit, but it makes my nana happy because being human involves putting on your vest. I will explain that in a minute. It requires continuous learning and adaptation, and it requires commissioners to take responsibility for nurturing healthy systems. So we'll dig into each of those three in turn. So firstly, being human means putting on your vest. Means responding to the variety of human need and experience. Means using empathy to understand the life of others. Viewing people from a strengths-based perspective, so they're not just problems, they're not just a homeless person or a person with mental health problems, they are a whole person with strengths. And it needs to trust people with decision-making in exactly the ways that you've heard this morning. And for commissioners, that means giving long-term funding, giving funding without performance measures, KPIs, all that business attached to it. Because KPIs, all that business, it make it more difficult to create good outcomes and they waste time and money. They are ineffective, why would you do it? It's all about maintaining the illusion of control. You didn't have control anyway, let's just stop pretending. And just to show that this isn't me talking about this stuff off the top of my head, there's organisations doing this stuff right now in the UK. Plymouth City Council, about 6 weeks ago, signed off, finished their tendering process. They have let an £80 million 10-year tender for a system for adults with complex needs on an alliance contract basis with no outputs or outcomes in the tender. They basically said, we found the organisations we trust to work together effectively, and we trust them because they learn. The council have become part of the alliance to do this. They have created the conditions under which it is possible for bespoke responses and for those responses to adapt and change over time. Learning. This is really, really crucial. So our current understanding of learning is that it's kind of a phase in social innovation. So we have a problem, so we learn and experiment about it. And when we find, the purpose of the learning and experimentation is to find what works, is to find the right answer to that particular problem. And when we find what works, we do more of that. So this is the Young Foundation's classic stages of social innovation diagram. It starts with a prompt, a problem. You do proposals and prototyping. When you find what works, you sustain and you take it to scale. Trouble is, in complex environments, that doesn't work. It's just the wrong strategy. So in a complex environment, learning is a continuous process. There is no such thing as what works in a complex environment because what works is always changing. What worked at one point in time won't work in another. What worked for one person won't work for another. What worked at this point, because other stuff will change, won't necessarily work in the future. What works is a continuous process of learning and adaptation. So for commissioners, what that means is that funders and commissioners are purchasing the capacity for organisations to learn and adapt. They are not purchasing a standardised service. Again, this is what Plymouth have just done. This is the process that York is just starting. This stuff is real and it's out there. Systems. So, again, if the purpose of commissioning changes, they're not purchasing services that deliver outcomes. They're starting to view themselves in a language that we pinched from the Institute for Government as systems stewards. People whose job it is to look after the health of a system. So, if it's your job to look after the health of a system because healthy systems produce good outcomes, you naturally come to the question, what does a healthy system look like? How do we know if we've got one? Well, there are people starting to answer this question. So the Lankelly Chase Foundation, not 2 minutes from this very building, have produced a set of system behaviours. So how we would expect people to behave in a system that serves adults with complex needs well. You can see those, there's a hyperlink embedded in this, presumably they'll be circulated. And that's me. Thanks for listening, folks.